Good morning. You're listening to Retake Our Democracy, a 30-minute weekly show that airs at 8:30 a.m. each Saturday morning on KSFR 101.1, your Santa Fe public radio station. I'm Paul Gibson, the host of Retake Our Democracy. Today, I'm going to be talking with an old friend and compatriot, Mariel Nanasi, the Executive Director of New Energy Economy. And remarkably, we may not even mention the words PNM, PRC, or ETA, as our focus is on the now infamous Inflation Reduction Act, the bastardized result of what happens when unprincipled legislators work hard to achieve a compromise. As we will discuss, the result from such a process may be nice tasting, but ultimately toxic sausage. Mariel and I will discuss this in just a minute, but a couple of announcements. Last week, I spoke with Rochelle Williams, co-founder of Blue CD2, an organization founded to retake CD2 for the Democrats in New Mexico. The week before that, I spoke with Gabe Vasquez. He's the Democratic candidate for the U.S. Congress in CD2. And that was perhaps the best interview, most uplifting interview I've ever done in 6 years of doing Retake on the radio. If you're driving around and miss any of today's show, you can watch the full YouTube recording of this show and any prior interview by going to retakeourdemocracy.org, clicking on the Retake on the Radio button on the right side of the homepage. And you'll find YouTube recordings of all of our previous shows listed there in chronological order. So you can binge watch all of our radio shows for free. We'll get to Mariel in just a minute. Before we start, I want to acknowledge that we are conducting this show on stolen Tewa land, and to thank our Tewa neighbors for being such good stewards of the land. We could learn much from their custodial care for the land, water, and air. And we better figure it out fast, because it ain't coming, help isn't coming from Washington. In addition to working on the general election, Retake is beginning to focus on the 2023 legislative session with a Zoominar series focusing on key issues we hope will become bills we will be supporting or initiatives we will oppose. We kicked off the series last month with a Zoominar focused on gun violence prevention with Miranda Viscoli, co-president of New Mexicans to Prevent Gun Violence, and Janae Martinez, a student activist from Albuquerque. We discussed what might be possible in 2023 by way of meaningful gun violence prevention legislation and how you can help. The second Zoominar in the series was conducted the last Wednesday of July. We focused on modernizing the legislature with Representatives Angelica Rubio from Las Cruces, Cristina Ortez from Taos, and activist Rick Ann Bach of Indivisible Santa Fe, and Carol Lynch, co-founder of Legislative Momentum. There is a strong movement among 10 Democratic women state representatives to reform the New Mexico state legislature with longer sessions, more paid staff, and paid legislators. We are the only state that doesn't pay our legislators. We learned why this reform is needed and how differently the legislature could function. We are planning Zoominars throughout the summer and fall, with our next Zoominar being on Tuesday, September 13th from 6 to 7:30, focusing on the Health Security Act in New Mexico. Our panelist will be Mary Feldblum, who for over 20 years has been leading the effort to achieve health security in New Mexico. She deserves a statue outside the Roundhouse. Joining Mary on the panel will be two of her key legislative allies, Senator Jerry Ortiz-Pino and Representative Day Hockman-Vigil, two legislators who will be working to pass legislation to pass HSA implementation legislation. And that should be a very interesting Zoominar, because we'll also be discussing progress that's been made on the 6 questions that need to be answered before we can implement the Health Security Act. Things like enrollment, how will that be done? Rates, how will that be done? Doctors, billing, how will that be done? And that work is being done on the funding from the junior bill in the 2022 legislative session. We're hoping that by next session, we're ready to ask for full authorization of the Health Security Act. So you'll want to tune into that Zoominar on September 13th. That's our last announcement. except I do want to mention that if you want to go and see the recordings of our Zoominars, and that would be both the gun violence prevention one and the one on modernizing the legislature, you go to retakeourdemocracy.org, go to the actions and events in the homepage banner, click there, and you'll find a link to all of our Zoominars near the top of the page. Okay, let's talk to Mariel Nanasi. Are you ready, Mariel?
I'm ready. Thanks so much for having me.
Okay. I'd like to let our guests introduce themselves, and I'm guessing that most of our listeners know who you are. So tell us just a little bit about how you got involved in climate activism generally, and then tell us a little something our listeners probably don't know about you.
So I'm going to keep this really short because we don't have that much time together, but really, I don't know how I first learned about climate disruption, but in 2008, I went to a Bioneers conference. For those of you who don't know what Bioneers is, you can Google that. And I went in California, and I began to understand and learn about the urgency of climate and the crisis that we're in. And I thought, how can I look at my children in their eyes and tell them that I did nothing with the talent that I have to weigh in on this crisis. And it's particularly appropriate because my daughter was just is now engaged to be married, and so I'm wanting her to have a future, and so that's something that most people don't know.
Okay, well, I knew that, but our listeners probably didn't. Congratulations.
Thank you.
It's a big moment. Today, we're focusing on the Inflation Reduction Act, Mariel. So let's start with what is particularly good in the bill. And there is a lot that is good. What struck you as being particularly good, Mariel?
The Inflation Reduction Act, as it is called, earmarks over $369 billion over 10 years for climate and energy measures. I think that's good. It's not good enough, but it's good, and it's the first climate bill that we really have ever had. So that's good. I think that there's some what I want to tell you is that the US spends $800 billion per year on the military. And so you need to put that into perspective. However, this is real money. And so that's good. There are other good things, like there are taxes on some of the wealthiest corporations. That's very necessary. There's money for some enforcement on methane leakages and such like that. There's money for energy efficiency. There's money for other kinds of things that are related to wind and solar and other clean energy projects like research and development. So those are the biggest good things, I would say.
Well, I would just add to that, the tax credits, they've changed the way the tax credits are done so that solar developers, they extend for 10 years so that solar and grid developers actually have a sense of how much money they're going to have or are going to get in tax credits over an extended period of time. And when you're doing these long-term projects, you need to have that kind of knowledge. So I think that's also pretty good. And then another thing that's just not even related to climate change was that Medicare will be authorized to negotiate pharmaceutical prices, and that could save billions of dollars for particularly older people like me.
Yes, I agree with both of those statements.
Okay, so that's a lot to like. What would you say is the most impactful of these bill provisions?
Well, you have the ones that I like or the ones that I don't like?
No, the ones that you like. We'll get to the not like in just a second.
I mean, I think that the biggest thing is that there's finally some action on climate. And is it enough? And does it include too many other things is the question I think is what we're going to discuss today. But I think that finally the government is responding to the people. And it's after years and years of efforts by people like you and me and thousands of other activists in all sorts of different ways, whether it's changing your credit card so that you're not investing in fossil fuels, or demonstrating, or filing lawsuits, or the whole gamut of all the things, including civil disobedience, that we've seen that's happened over the last, 30, 50 years to try to get the government to act on climate. So I think that's good.
Does it feel like a tipping point, perhaps?
I mean, I think that we wouldn't see people like Senator Manchin finally having to give in if it wasn't for this activism.
Yeah. Well, sadly, there's plenty of very big problems with the bill. And so can you tell us a little bit about them? Let's start with the gas and oil being prioritized over wind and solar and leases on federal land. Can you give us the details on this and explain what this would likely allow?
This is the worst part of the bill. First of all, I just want to say that the fossil fuel industry likes this bill. And if it's great for the fossil fuel industry, it probably means it's terrible for our climate and our collective future on the earth. So that's like red flag number one. And regarding the details, this is what's bad and what's really bad. The bill forces the Interior Department to lease at least 2 million acres of public lands, federal lands, and 60 million acres of offshore waters for oil and gas each year for a decade as a prerequisite. And that word is so important, prerequisite for any new solar or wind energy development. So basically it's saying that before any solar and wind development on federal land or offshores, the oil and gas industry has to be given this enormous amounts for leasing. Just for some perspective, 600 million acres of offshore leasing amounts to 4 times the size of the Gulf of Mexico, its outer continental shelf. And the fossil fuel industry has been leased 1 million acres of land on average since 2009. This doubles that. This is clearly fossil fuel expansion.
No, that's certainly bad enough, but another provision of the legislation is to increase tax credits for carbon capture technology by 70%. Can you tell us a little bit about why this makes no sense? What is carbon capture, and is there any evidence that it can work? And if carbon capture can't work, why would Congress want to invest in it?
It's a great question. It's something else that has risen to the top of our poison pills for this bill. Clean energy, the definition of clean energy is expanded and defined to include hydrogen and carbon capture sequestration, both things that help the fossil fuel industry and props them up. There is actually no evidence that either of them work. All efforts and attempts to make hydrogen plants or carbon capture sequestration have either failed in disastrous ways, including billions of dollars, but also have failed to reduce emissions, which is the critical thing. We already have the answer. And that's one of the problems with them expanding the fossil fuel definition. The clean energy definition to include fossil fuels is that it presents an opportunity cost. So it's not only that it requires oil and gas drilling, but it also is a distraction because now we have to fight all these false solutions when we have available wind and solar that needs to be deployed now and works and is proven technology.
So I need to take a brief break here to remind our listeners that KSFR is more important than ever these days, with so much misinformation out there in the media, mainstream and social media. You get the straight scoop from KSFR, whether it's from the news programming. They have Democracy Now!, Retake Our Democracy, all kinds of great information-based programs, interview programs, as well as music and cultural events. So you get all that free when you turn on KSFR, but it's not free to develop all that stuff, and they need donations. So when you're done listening to this program, I would encourage you to go to ksfr.org and click on the donate button and think of that, give them 10, 20, 50 bucks and think of that as your ticket for admission to some great programming. There's such a great program. Thank you. Thank you, KSFR. So in addition to giving priority to gas and oil on federal leases, isn't there some kind of provision to protect fossil fuel industry from legal action or regulatory restrictions? What is that about?
Yeah, that's the other really scary thing. And basically what this bill does is it allows for, they call it efficient permitting process. And that's like code word for rubber stamping. And we're already seeing under the current framework of regulatory action, accident after accident after accident. Just in New Mexico, just with fracking here. Now, this is not just federal lands, but it's fracking on private state and federal lands. We have an average of about 4 toxic wastewater discharges a day. That's the average. And there has been 0 done by this administration or the federal government to stop that. And we're talking about carcinogenic waste from fracking that is discharged into our waterways, and the land. And nothing's being done about it. So we are poisoning our land and poisoning our water. And so the current system of regulation is inadequate. And what does this bill do? It fast tracks regulation and the permitting process, or the permitting process pursuant to alleged regulation. So this is a very, very big concern. And the oil and gas industry has been using this mantra of, oh, regulation is keeping us from economic benefits. But in the fact of the matter is it's not. Exxon and Chevron have made record profits in the last quarter alone, let alone before. And our environment and our climate is suffering. So as a matter of fact, that's another one of the things that is really problematic about this bill, is that in the recent past, there have been court decisions that have rejected the leasing on federal land, in particular, the largest leasing in the Gulf of Mexico was rejected by a district court in Washington, D.C., because it failed to take into account climate and cumulative impacts and of drilling and oil and gas development. This bill overturns that court decision and would, as I said, increase permitting, rubber stamping it, and that's a real fear of ours, because the current regulation has led already to so many accidents and problems. And I just want you all to know that this is very important. This is a matter of environmental justice and racism in particular. But the 4 locations that are essentially targeted for this drilling and development is the Gulf of Mexico, which is like Texas, Louisiana, that whole area, Texas for the Permian Basin, New Mexico for the Permian Basin, and Alaska. That's where the focus of this is going to be. And so New Mexico is will be further at risk because of this legislation.
Okay. That's plenty bad. In Retake's blog on Tuesday, I wrote about how when you have an unprincipled Congress, this is the kind of hodgepodge schizophrenic legislation that you wind up with. What do you feel is the appropriate response to this legislation? I keep thinking how Joe Manchin held out and held out and held out for one concession after another because he's the one senator that they need. But they need the progressives to support this as well. Have you heard anything from like about Bernie Sanders or Elizabeth Warren or someone like that saying, wait a minute, you know, you're giving away the store here. We're not signing on either unless you get rid of some of this stuff.
That's why New Energy Economy has launched a letter writing campaign to our federal delegation. I agree with you completely. Just the way that Manchin stands up and says, no, I'm not going to do it until I get what I want. Why don't the progressive senators huddle and get together and demand amendments? There's some really good things in here, as you've pointed out. I think that there could be essentially tweaks. Yes, I'd rather have, 3 billion, billions and billions of more dollars invested in clean energy and a comprehensive look at addressing like real action on climate. There's so many things that we could have, and I'd like to kick out the hydrogen and CCS, but some of these things are just intolerable. The biggest two things I believe are this prerequisite for before you get to wind and solar, you are forced to invest in oil and gas, even if it doesn't make market sense, even if it doesn't make economic sense, even if it doesn't make environmental or climate sense. So that seems crazy to me. The other thing.
Let me ask you something, Mariel. Is it that they have to lease the land or the waters, or they have to offer it for lease? Because someone wrote to me in a comment on the blog that was published on Tuesday, that they don't think that gas and oil is going to want to invest enormously in some of this, the requirement for infrastructure for an industry that's going to be a dying industry. And so if we put up the offer for leasing and they don't accept any of those leases, does that meet the criteria of the bill?
I think it's a good question. And I frankly am not equipped enough in federal leasing law to know the answer to that, and whether that just putting it up for bid is enough. The other issue I will just say is sometimes, the big oil buys leases to jack up the price, jack up their stock, their portfolio, saying that they have the option to do that drilling, even if they don't do that drilling. So that's another question that I believe remains unanswered. However, the precedent of it is really scary. We know that oil and gas is, destructive to the climate. We should be using the oil and gas that we can use, the tiny little budget that's left, the carbon budget that's left, to be advancing clean energy solutions, not doubling down on fossil fuel expansion. That's the ultimate thing that we just can't have. And I do think that there's other questions about how is Wall Street and big financiers going to invest their money? Are they going to, continue to invest in oil and gas? And I think, again, actions by disinvestment campaigns and divestment campaigns have had an impact. Is it enough? Not nearly. So, but this is a precedent that we can't afford at this time in our trajectory. So that's something that we really oppose, and we really oppose permissive permitting, and the inclusion of hydrogen and CCS. But I don't like the inclusion of nuclear either. So there's other things that we would change in the bill. But the big question I think that you asked was about the politics of it. So why aren't the progressive Democrats gathering together all their muscle and saying, we must make amendments in order to make this beginning, it's a beginning, this beginning climate bill, have a chance. And also, if the idea in part is to promote excitement for Democrats in the electoral season, I mean, people who are going to look at this and say, this is unfortunately, either they're going to say it's not enough, it's too little, or that it's a veil for bad things because big oil loves it. And that really worries me, because that turns off more people than it brings into the fold.
Okay, well, we've only got about a minute left in the show, and then we'll continue this discussion offline. And people who are listening to the radio show, you'll want to get the link to the YouTube recording, because we're going to talk about whether on the whole this bill should be voted up or voted down. And I don't think either one of us actually knows how we're going to answer that question yet. But that's about all the time we have for today. I want to thank you for being with us. And I want to alert you to something else. Next week, I'm going to have internationally known and best-selling author and climate journalist, Dar Jamail, on the radio show. And I haven't had him on in almost a year. And he's a friend of Mariel and Jeff's and Roxanne and I. And he's also it's not like he's the all-time greatest scientist on climate change, but his spiritual understanding of what's going on is just off the charts. And he's shifted from we got to try and stop climate change to we've got to be able to adapt to it, because we have already missed the boat on fixing this. And so he's a very interesting man, and I would encourage you to listen next week. But that's all we have time for today. We'll be back next week. And in the meantime, stay healthy, stay safe, but most of all, stay active. It's the only way we fix this mess. Bye-bye. Okay, we're back. We're back because we promised more talk, and we're going to give it. Okay, so I read that a group of climate activists led by indigenous activists marched to the Department of the Interior on Monday and erected a teepee and hung a banner saying climate emergency. And they were demanding that the president declare a climate emergency. Is this the kind of action we need more of? And what difference would it make if Biden declares a climate emergency?
This is so great. People ask what difference does any single action make? Of course, that's much bolder. They also did one other thing that I'd like to just share, is that they wrote climate emergency in enormous letters on the street in front of the Department of Interior. Here's the thing. We never know what is going to be the action that matters. We have to do as much as we can, and in as creative and varied, layered ways as possible, because we need everybody. We need painters, we need writers, we need speakers, we need activists of all kind. That's what this crisis demands. And we don't know what action is going to make the difference. I think the thing about the climate emergency is it's sort of a Wizard of Oz moment. If we say that it's a climate emergency and declare that it's a climate emergency, and you test this Infrastructure Reduction Act against that concept, that we're in a crisis, that we're in an emergency, then you see how paltry this bill is. It's just that it's exciting because it's finally something meaningful is here. But again, I said relative to the military budget, it's not enough.
Or
If we're
relative to the $3 trillion that was the original proposal. This is just a little over a tenth of it.
exactly.
Paltry.
Exactly. So when you start saying, defining, and we are very moved by ideas, as we should be. We're very moved by love. There's nothing tangible about that, and it makes us change our lives. The same thing with another idea, and that is of emergency. When there's an emergency, you have to act quickly, boldly, strategically. And this lacks that kind of emphasis, and it lacks that kind of power, ferocity. And also there's just been so much injustice and degradation that's been heaped on peoples and the planet, that this is also very small, not only in terms of the money, but in terms of the effort. I mean, I want to raise something with you. I know we need money to change the grid, but do we want the money that is even in this bill for grid investment to go to the exact same climate arsonists and greedy corporations that cause the problem? Like, that doesn't make sense to me at all. Is that the number one problem of the bill? No, but those are the kinds of things that when you say, this is a climate emergency, you wouldn't ever do that. You wouldn't say to the rapist, here's a condom. You know what I mean? No, you would say, get out of here. Let's find a solution for you. Potentially imprisonment, even though I'm generally an anti-carceral activist. But you know what I mean? That's where it's so different. And that's what it's sort of like. It's like a really baby step. And it's only because we've done nothing. And we are the major climate emitter, climate causer and polluting emitter in the world, that something is like, finally some action. And I have to tell you, my gut reaction is like, yes, maybe something good. And I want there to be something good. And we all want there to be something good. But if there's things like this, which are, Orwellian moments, calling hydrogen clean energy, things like that, then it makes things confusing, and it makes, it's like lettuce and cake as a diet. It doesn't work, it's like, well, if we want to solve the climate crisis, we don't continue to expand fossil fuels. And I have to just say, I was very moved, not only by the action of our friends and activists who took that bold actions, young Native American and African Americans who risked their personal life for the benefit of us all. And so I'm very moved by that, and called out the truth. The truth matters.
So here's the $1 million question. You're sitting in the Senate and you're a Democratic senator, and the vote is tied 50-50. What do? Thumbs up or thumbs down on the bill? It hasn't been changed at all.
Well, first of all, I would have to have had my own experience of trying my damnedest. And that I'm one of the people who does try really hard and works really hard to build a coalition to have some amendments. And, we've just been talking about the most important amendments. If we couldn't get any of the amendments, and depending on what kind of action I had been working on building, if all of those people joined me and tried but failed and promise that they would keep to some other promises going forward, I might have to say yes. If, on the other hand, there was no effort to make any amendments, even after I tried, I might try something else.
Mhm.
You know,
Yeah, for
I
me,
mean,
there's,
these are legislators, right? They're supposed, but they're in the business of amendment making. Put them to work.
I guess the way I see it is that if we made the amendments you and I would like to see, we lose Manchin and Sinema or whatever her name is.
Cinema, yeah.
Sinema. And then we don't have anything, but is nothing better than this. And it's one of the tougher calls, and it brings to mind how this stuff was put together. First of all, I think that Biden knows, and the Democrats know, that they need a win somewhere, even if the win is tainted. But being able to march around the country for the next 4 months talking about the Inflation Reduction Act, no coincidence in the title of that. Doesn't say anything about climate or anything. And so I think that the Democrats do need a win there, and cutting being able to negotiate prescription drug prices, and for God's sakes, taxing the rich and the mega corporations. That's going to be a popular thing to mention in your debates and so forth. So I understand why they would go to the wall on this and why they wouldn't accept amendments. But that doesn't mean I have to. And I don't know. The more we talked about it during the show, the less I liked it. And I just don't like being put in this position. It's sort of like giving you a gun and putting a couple of bullets in it and spinning it and telling you, you have no choice. You've got to, I'm going to shoot you or you're going to pull the trigger. And so you're just going like, okay, well, I don't like that choice, but it's the only one I have. And it does feel like in some.
I think that what you said is really important. I'm sorry to interrupt, but we've had an ever increasing cascades of fires, floods, heat waves, and droughts just in the last 2 months. We're talking, I just read something that there have been 9 single more than $1 billion emergencies called in the United States this year, resulting from climate disaster. If it were me and I was one of those legislators, I would get my group of legislators together and I would keep on pushing that. So Massachusetts, Kentucky, New Mexico, Yellowstone, right? If we had Yosemite, if we had those people, 5 of them, 10 of them going out and saying, hey, this is not enough. This is an emergency. That's why I think the emergency is so important. And saying we are putting our lives, our water, our land at risk, and really making an argument for it, then things will change. Because you know what? Republicans need water. Republicans need clean, air. And Republicans live in the fires and the drought-stricken and flood-stricken areas in New Mexico and Kentucky. I mean, 14 people just were killed in Kentucky. That's
25.
25. Okay, so look, so that's what I would do. I would make the argument real, because this is real, because that's what we're fighting for. So now my answer is, unless it had amendments, I would say no, but I would fight for those amendments. I'd organize with my fellow senators and I'd go out on TV, because they have bully pulpits and they don't use it for the people and for justice. And that is unacceptable.
Okay, well, I'm sort of with you on this one. I think in the end of the day, I might vote yes, and then, want to blow up the legislature. I'd want to. That's already been tried this year. So I'll pass on that. But no, I think then it'd be like trying to fix it or get other legislation passed to insulate against it. I don't know if you can undo some of the provisions, but you're dealing with the same cast of characters. And I guess the bottom line for me is, and with the midterms coming up, we need 52 real Democrats, or 50 real Democrats, not 48 and 2 Republicans in Democratic clothing. And without that, we're never, I mean, the bottom line is we don't have the power to make this happen the way we would want to make it happen. And as long as we don't have that power, we're going to keep getting the same results. And that we don't have time for that. So,
but that includes having these senators really stand for something. And I'm not seeing it so far. I mean, they're not coming out and saying or doing what is necessary to pass a strong bill. And Manchin is, but they're not.
yeah, I'm actually surprised Bernie Sanders hasn't said anything about this as far as I know. As soon as we get done recording this show, I'm going to have to go take a look and see if Bernie has said anything, because at the very least, we should be having those people saying this is not the right bill. It may be that we're going to vote for it because we have a gun to our head, and it's at least something, but it's got as much bad in it as it does good. And that's not creating good legislation, and it's not acting like this is an emergency at all. So, Mariel, the one other question I was going to try and get this in on the radio show, but I knew you wouldn't be able to keep it to 2 minutes. You and I have been working on a coalition to try and get a plan together for New Mexico to benefit more economically and environmentally from our own renewable energy. And can you tell us a little bit about what that work is about and where people can find out more information about it?
Yeah. Before I answer that, I just encourage people to go on to New Energy Economy's website and to forward an email letter to our federal legislators to demand some of the amendments that we've been talking about. And we've only asked for 3 of them, the top 3. And hopefully Retake and some of our other friends will join in that effort. Public power. I think it's one of the most exciting things that could be. Again, it's about giving people the power as opposed to the same corporations that have caused the climate crisis to begin with. And it gets us there faster. It gets us to clean energy faster. It gets us to a greater resilient grid faster, more reliably and cheaply. I believe, for instance, I'm pretty sure that most of your listeners are in Santa Fe. I think that if we had public power in Santa Fe, either a municipal utility, or if we had local choice energy passed in the next legislative session, that we would be able to have enough solar that we either own or contract for, and storage, and wind that we buy from 80 miles away to meet all our needs at a cheaper price than what PNM can offer within 5 years.
PNM did wind up in the conversation.
Oh yeah.
I knew we couldn't do it. I knew we couldn't do it.
Yeah, well, the problem is that just like this other bill that we're talking about, they have been the barrier in Santa Fe. And so the thing is that we could make the change that we need that will really benefit all of us economically, all of us environmentally. We'd have cleaner air, and we'd have a stronger economy, and we'd put so many people, hundreds, if not thousands of people to work in a clean energy economy. And so it's really just completely revamping the economic energy system that we currently have, which goes from one that is monopoly controlled and and is based on just some fossil fuels that are usually placed where people who have the least access to power, mostly people of color and poor people, live, to one where we have decentralized energy that is not harmful and can provide economic benefit, local wealth creation.
Okay. And where can people get information about this?
Thank you. publicpowernm.org. publicpowernm.org. And what's exciting about it is it's not just New Energy Economy and Retake Our Democracy. There's about 25 organizations all across the state of New Mexico, everywhere from Gallup to Las Cruces to Taos, that are in support of this. And that's a very exciting proposition too. It's got a lot of people support.
And we meet every Tuesday to discuss this and try and move the ball forward. It's complicated stuff, but thank you for leading that effort. One last question for you. As I mentioned earlier, I'm going to be interviewing Dar Jamal on the radio show next week. What one question would you want me to ask him, and why?
What makes your life meaningful?
I think I know the answer. It's when he goes to the woods. He's in the woods as much as he's behind a computer.
And he climbs a lot, yeah, but also in snow and ice and camping and stuff like that. But I think that the thing, and maybe he's going to say nature, maybe he's going to say love and friendship. Maybe he's, he's not an activist like we are, though he's a writer. But I think that that's been a journey, and we're always wanting to know from the people that we love what makes their life meaningful.
Okay.
That's what we have that conversation every so often. So that's the question I would ask him, especially after he knows what he knows, given, his last book was called, oh no, not his last book, but the book before it was called End of Ice. And
Yeah.
he knows that, but his new book is about interviewing, I forget what the title is, something like We're in the Middle of Everything or something like that. It's an interview with, I'd say, a dozen Native activists and their perspective on the climate disruption and what to do. So maybe he can share that and why he came to do the project that he did.
Okay. Well, I will use that question, Mariel, I promise. I'm writing the questions when we get done with this interview. So anyway, thank you very much for taking the time. Congratulations on Rosa and Eric's engagement. I hope they're going to get married in Santa Fe. Oh, they are?
Yeah.
Okay. All right. So then we can be there easily.
Yes, you're invited already.
We've missed a couple of weddings already because of COVID, of friends of ours, where we just couldn't get there. So I'm glad it's going to be here. Anyway.
Thank you so much, Paul, for everything you and Roxanne do.
Oh, thank you for everything you and Jeff do, and Justin and Rosa do. Well, the apple doesn't fall far from the tree. All right, take care. That's it for today, everybody. We'll be back next week with Dar Jamal. And in the meantime, stay safe, stay active. Got to fix this mess. We got a lot to do. Bye-bye.
Bye.